Hi, this is Sharon Hill with No Critics, Just Politics. Today we're going to talk about the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement, which is also known as the African American Civil Rights Movement, was a decade-long movement with the goal of securing legal rights for African Americans that other Americans already held, with roots starting in the Reconstruction era during the late 19th century. The movement resulted in the largest legislative impacts after the direct actions and grassroots protests organized from the mid-1950s until 1968. And what it did was encompass strategies, various groups, and organized social movements to accomplish some of the goals of ending legalized racial segregation and discrimination in the United States. The movement, using major nonviolent campaigns, eventually secured new recognition in federal law and federal protection for all Americans. After the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery in the 1980s, the Reconstruction Amendments to the United States Constitution sought to secure the rights of African Americans. Now, while for a short time African Americans voted and held political office, they were soon deprived of civil rights, often under Jim Crow laws, and subjected to demonstration and sustained violence. Over the following century, various efforts were made by African Americans to secure their legal rights. Between 1955 and 1968, acts of nonviolent protest and civil disobedience produced crisis situations and productive dialogues between activists and government authorities. Federal, state, and local governments, businesses, and communities often had to respond immediately to these situations, which highlighted the inequities faced by African Americans. The lynching of Emmett Till and the visceral response to his mother's decision to have an open casket funeral mobilized the African American community nationwide. Forms of protest and civil disobedience included boycotts such as the successful Montgomery bus boycott, which occurred between 1955 and 56, and in Alabama there were sit-ins such as the influential Greensboro sit-in, which occurred in 1960, and in North Carolina we had another successful Nashville sit-in in Tennessee. Marches such as the 1963 Birmingham Children's Crusade and in 1965 Selma to Montgomery marches, which occurred also in 1965 in Alabama. And also too, we had a wide range of other nonviolent activities. Moderates in the movement worked with Congress to achieve the passage of several significant pieces of federal legislation overturning discriminatory practices. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 expressly banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. In employment practices, it ended unequal application of voter registration requirements and prohibited racial segregation in schools, at the workplace, and in public accommodations. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 restored and protected voting rights for minorities by authorizing federal oversight of registration and elections in areas with a historic underrepresentation of minorities as voters. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 banned discrimination in the sale of rental of housing. African Americans re-entered politics in the South and across the country. Young people were inspired to take action. Now, from 1964 through 1970, a wave of inner-city riots in the black communities somewhat undercut the support from the white middle class, but increased support from private foundations. The emergence of the Black Power movement which lasted from 1965 to 1975, challenged the established black leadership for its cooperative attitude and its practice of nonviolence, and instead in demanding that in addition to the new laws gained through nonviolent movement, political and economic self-sufficiency built in the black communities. Many popular representations of the movement were centered on the charismatic leadership and the philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr., who won the 1964 Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the movement. However, some scholars note that the movement was way too diverse to be credited to any one organization or strategy. Now, before the American Civil War, almost 4 million blacks were enslaved in the South. Only white men or property could vote, and the Naturalization Act of 1790 limited U.S. citizenship to whites only. Following the Civil War, 3 constitutional amendments were passed, including the 13th Amendment, which occurred in 1865 that ended slavery, the 14th Amendment, which occurred in 1868 that gave African American citizenship, adding their total population of 4 million to the official population of southern states for congressional appointment, and the 15th Amendment, which occurred in 1870 that gave African American males the right to vote. Only males could vote in the U.S. at that time. This is some of the background. Some additional background is that from 1865 to 1877, the United States underwent a turbulent Reconstruction era trying to establish free labor and civil rights of freemen in the South after the end of slavery. However, many whites resisted the social changes, leading to an insurgent movement such as the Ku Klux Klan, whose members attacked black and white Republicans to maintain white supremacy. In 1871, President Ulysses S. Grant, the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Attorney General Amos T. Ackerman initiated a campaign to repress the KKK under the Enforcement Act. Some states were reluctant to enforce the federal measures of the act. By the early 1870s, other white supremacists and paramilitary groups arose that violently opposed African American legal equity and suffrage. However, if the states failed to implement the acts, the laws allowed the federal government to get involved. Many Republican governors were afraid of sending black militia troops to fight the Klan for fear of war. So after the disputed election of 1876 that resulted in the end of Reconstruction and the federal troops were withdrawn, whites in the South regained political control of the region's state legislature by the end of the century, after having intimidated and violently attacking blacks before and during elections. From 1890 to 1908, Southern states passed new constitutions and laws to disenfranchise African Americans and many poor whites by creating barriers to voter registration. Voting rolls were dramatically reduced as blacks and poor whites were forced out of the electoral politics. After the landmark court case of Smith v. Allwright, progress was made in increasing black political participation in the Rim South and academia, although almost entirely in the urban areas and a few rural localities where most blacks work outside the plantation. The status quo ante of excluding African Americans from the political system lasted in the remainder of the South, especially North Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, until national civil rights legislation was passed in the mid-1960s to provide federal enforcement of constitutional voting rights. For more than 60 years, blacks in the South were not able to elect anyone to represent their interests in Congress or local government. Since they could not vote, they could not serve on local juries. We're going to take a break right now. We'll be back after our station break. This is No Critics, Just Politics, your host, Sharon Hill.
You are listening to No Critics, Just Politics with Sharon Hill on sualgonovo.com radio.
And we're back. This is Sharon Hill with No Critics, Just Politics. And our discussion is on the Civil Rights Movement. Now, during this period of the white-dominated Democratic Party, which was maintaining political control of the South, whites controlling all the seats representing the total population of the South, they had a powerful voting bloc in Congress. The Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, the party to which most blacks had belonged, shrank to an insignificance as black voter registration was suppressed except in remote Union areas of the Appalachian and the Ozark. Until 1965, the Solid South was a one-party system under the Democrats, except previous noted historical Union strongholds. The Democratic Party nomination was a tumultuous to elections for the state and local office. In 1901, President Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to dine at the White House, making him the first African American to attend an official dinner there. The invitation was roundly criticized by Southern politicians and newspapers. Washington persuaded the president to appoint more blacks to federal posts in the South and to try to boost the African American leadership in state Republican organizations. However, this was resisted by both white Democrats and white Republicans as an unwanted federal intrusion into state politics. During the same time as African Americans were being disenfranchised, white Southerners imposed racial segregation by law. Violence against blacks increased with numerous lynchings throughout the turn of the century. The system of de jure state-sanctioned racial discrimination and oppression that emerged from the post-Reconstruction South became known as the Jim Crow system. The United States Supreme Court, made up almost entirely of Northerners, upheld the constitutionality of these state laws that require racial segregation in public facilities. In its 1896 decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, legitimizing them through the separate but equal doctrine. Segregation, which began with slavery, continued with Jim Crow laws, with signs used to show blacks where they could legally walk, talk, drink, rest, or eat. For those places that were racially mixed, non-whites had to wait until all white customers were dealt with. Elected in 1912, President Woodrow Wilson ordered segregation throughout the federal government. Segregation remained intact until the mid-1950s, when many states began to gradually integrate their schools following the unanimous Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education that overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. The early 20th century is a period often referred to as the nadir of American race relations. While tensions and civil rights violations were almost intense in the South, social discrimination affected African Americans in other regions as well. At the national level, the Southern Bloc controlled important committees in Congress, defeated passage of laws against lynching, and exercised considerable power beyond the number of whites in the South. Some of the characteristics of the post-Reconstruction period included racial segregation, which was by law. Public facilities and government services such as education were divided into separate white and colored domains. Characteristically, those for color were underfunded and of inferior quality. Disenfranchisement. While white Democrats regained power, they passed laws that made voter registration more restrictive, essentially forcing black voters off the voting rolls. The number of African American voters dropped dramatically, and they were no longer able to elect representatives.